Hi everyone, this is Ms. Brubeck, and I'm going to be recording notes on how to factor trinomials when the leading coefficient is greater than 1. So we learned last week, how to factor trinomials that looked like this when we didn't have like this number 7 in front, where you just had like x squared plus 22x plus 3. And there was no number in front of the x squared. There was, but there was an invisible 1 was the number in front. So now we have a 7 in front, and that's going to change things. The first step is still pretty simple, but what we're going to do is we need to multiply the 7 and the 3. That's step 1. So we're going to multiply this 7 times this 3, which is going to get us 21. So that means now we're trying to find two numbers that multiply to equal 21 and add to equal to 22. So we're still trying to add to get that 22. So we need to find two numbers that multiply to equal 21 and add to equal 22. So two numbers that multiply to equal 21 add to 22. So if we think of all the numbers that multiply to 21, 1 and 21, and 7 and 3. So 1 plus 21, that's going to equal 22, and 7 plus 3 is 9. So which two factors are going to work for us? It's going to be the 1 and the 22, because those two numbers multiply to equal 21, and they add to be a 22. So we're going to use 1 and 21. That's pretty similar to what we did last week, but the next part is more challenging. So now we're going to be taking this original trinomial, 7x squared plus 22x plus 3. We're going to take that trinomial, and we're going to rewrite it, but we're not going to rewrite the 22x part. So we're going to have the 7x squared at the beginning. We're going to have the plus 3 at the end. But we're going to put 1x and 21x. And replace the 22x. So we're replacing this 22x with a 1, but we put an x underneath it. And our 21, but we're putting an x after it. So that is our next step. And now we're going to factor this. We're going to factor 7x squared plus 1x plus 21x plus 3. Excuse me. So to do that, we're first going to take this, we're going to break it into two parts. We're going to break it into 7x squared and 1x. So what we need to do here is we need to figure out, okay, what are the factors of 7x squared and 1x? We actually need to figure out what's the greatest common factor. What's the greatest common factor of 7x squared and 1x? And so you can figure that out, like 7, it just breaks down to 7 and 1. And 1 just breaks down to 1 times 1. But 7x squared, that means the 7 has two x's. X squared means that it has two x's. And the 1x has just 1x. So what do they share? They share a 1. And they also share an x. So the greatest common factor is going to be 1x. That's the greatest common factor of 7x squared plus 1x. Then what we want to do is we want to figure out, okay, what's the other factor? So we're going to ask ourselves, here we have 1x. 1x times what is going to multiply to get us 7x squared? 1x times what gets us 7x squared? Well, we know that 1 times 7 equals 7, so we can put a 7 here. And then if we have an x, we're going to need one more x here to get x squared. So we're going to add an x right here, and we can check our work. 1x times 7x, it does equal 7x squared. And then we're going to do the same thing here, but now we're going to say, okay, we've got 1x, and we need to multiply that times what to get 1x? Well, that's pretty simple. We're just going to multiply it times 1. And since it's a positive 1, we'll put a plus sign because 1x times 1, that equals 1x. So that's the first half. Then we have to factor the second half, and that's going to be 21x plus 3. I'm actually going to erase this part so I have room for the 21x and a 3. So if we break down the 21x, that's going to be 7 times 3, and then it also has an x. And if you break down 3, it only has factors of 1 and 3. So what's its greatest common factor? The greatest common factor is just 3. So instead of just writing 3, we'll write a plus 3 because it's a positive 3. And then we'll again have our parentheses. We're going to do the same thing here, but this time we're asking ourselves 3 times what multiplies to get 21x? 3 times what number multiplies to get 21x? Well, 3 times 7 multiplies to get 21, but we need to add an x to the 7. That way it multiplies to get 21x. So 3 times 7x multiplies to get 21x. Then we need to ask ourselves, okay, 3 times what multiplies to equal 3? Well, that's simple. 3 times 1 multiplies to equal 3. And since it's a positive 1, we'll just put 1. Now we're basically done, but I want to show you a way to always check to see if you're right. Notice how what's in the parentheses, it's the same. So if you see here, in the parentheses, we have 7x plus 1 and 7x plus 1. That's correct. That's how it should be. Whatever's in the parentheses should be the same. So we have 7x plus 1. That's going to be one of our factors. 7x plus 1 will be one of our factors. And then the other factor is going to be what's left over, 1x plus 3. So our other factor is 1x plus 3. I can do better than that. There we go. And this is your final answer. What we're saying is that if we were to multiply this together, if you multiplied 7x plus 1, and you multiply that by 1x plus 3, you would get your original trinomial of 7x squared plus 22x plus 3. That's it for slide 2, and now I'm going to move on to slide 3. So on slide 3, we're going to do the exact same thing that we did on the previous problem. We're going to take that first value and the last value, and we're going to multiply them together. So 6 times negative 2, that's negative 12. Oops, I don't know what happened there. Negative 12. So I'm trying to find two numbers that multiply to equal negative 12, and then add, there's an invisible positive 1 right there. So two numbers that multiply to get negative 12 and add to be a positive 1. So we're looking for two numbers that multiply to equal negative 12 and add to equal 1, positive 1. So if we think of all the things that multiply to get us a negative 12, in order to get a negative number, one of the numbers needs to be negative. So we could do negative 1 and positive 12, or we could do positive 1 and negative 12. Remember, to multiply to get a negative, one of the numbers has to be negative. We could do negative 6 and 2, or we could do positive 6 and negative 2. We also could do negative 3 and 4, or positive 3 and negative 4. So those are there's 6 different things that multiply to get negative 12. And then we need to add those. So negative 1 plus 12, that's a positive 11. And then 1 plus negative 12, that's a negative 11. Oops. Negative 6 plus 2, that's a negative 4. Positive 6 plus negative 2 is a positive 4. And then we have negative 3 plus 4, that's a positive 1. and positive 3 plus negative 4 is going to be a negative 1. So what's going to work? These all multiply to equal negative 12. Which one adds to positive 1? It's going to be these two factors, our negative 3 and our 4. So negative 3 and 4 will be our two factors. So then we're going to do the same thing we did before. We're going to look at this trinomial right here. Okay, we're going to look at that trinomial. And we're going to write down the first term, 6x squared. We're going to write down the last term. But then we're going to put the negative 3 in and the 4 in. That's going to replace the 1x. So it's going to be negative 3x. Make sure you put an x, and then the 4 is positive. So it'll be plus 4x. So we do the same thing we did last time. We'll break this down into two pieces. We'll do 6x squared and negative 3x squared. So when you're trying to figure out what's the GCF, when you have 6x squared, that can break down to 3 times 2, and then you have 2 x's. Oops. My mouse is having a hard time. 2 x's. And then we have negative 3x. So we can break that down to be negative 1 and 3 with an x. So what numbers do they share? They share a 3 and they share an x. So our greatest common factor is going to be 3x. Now when looking for the second factor, you want to ask yourself, okay, 3 times what is going to multiply to 6x squared? 3 times 2 is going to get us 6, and then we need one more x, because 3x times 2x will get us 6x squared. For the next one, we need to ask ourselves, 3x times what is going to multiply to a negative 3x? Well, that's pretty simple. It's just going to be negative 1. It's just going to be negative 1. 3x times negative 1 equals negative 3x. Then we need to break down the second part. We've got 4x squared minus 2. We need to figure out what is our greatest common factor. Oops. Let me do that again, because I accidentally erased the other part. So if we have 4x, that's going to just break down to 2 times 2. Oops, 2 times 2 and an x. And then negative 2 is just going to break down to negative 1 and 2. So what do they share? They only share 1, 2. So the greatest common factor is going to be 2. And since it's positive, we'll put plus 2. And then we'll need to ask ourselves, okay, 2 times what? 2 times what equals 4x? And that answer is going to be 2x. 2 times 2 equals 4. And then we're going to need an x for it to equal 4x. Then we want to ask ourselves, 2 times what equals negative 2? And that answer is going to be negative 1. 2 times negative 1 is going to equal negative 2. Now what you should see is that what's in the parentheses is going to be the same. And that is the case here. What's inside our parentheses, we have 2x minus 1. So that's going to be its own factor. 2x minus 1 will be one of the factors. And then the other factor is going to be what's left over, 3x plus 2. So our other factor is 3x plus 2. And so our final answer is 2x minus 1. That's one factor, and 3x minus 2. And what we're saying is that if we were to multiply those together, we'd get our original trinomial.